Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this session of the MCC at 100 conference called MCC and Transnational Flows of Agriculture Knowledge. My name is James Kornelsen. I work as the Public Engagement Manager at Canadian Foodgrains Bank. I'm participating from my office here at our main office located on Treaty 1 territory in downtown Winnipeg, just down the street from University of Winnipeg. And I'm pleased and grateful to be chairing this session and hearing from our four panelists, Iqbal Choudhary, Royden Loewen, Marta Bunnett, and Christopher Sundby, who you can see with me on the screen, I hope. I'll share a brief bio for each panelist before the presentation, and then they will each have about 15 to 17 minutes, I'll be counting, to present their research. But first, a few reminders about how you can participate. Feel free to use the chat box, those of you who are comfortable. If you want to introduce yourself, that's fine, but just be judicious about what you share, and hopefully we'll keep a good balance there. For questions, however, I invite you to use the Q&A feature to send your questions. We will have a Q&A time with our panelists at the end after all have had a chance to speak. If you fear forgetting your question, you can at any time enter a question into the Q&A feature. Hit that button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will log it for later. That helps us to keep track. And you can also request to answer your question another way using the chat box or raise hand feature. I will see it if you click on if you go to the chat box and click on hosts and panelists, then I can see that message. I'll also plan to put the panelist bios into the chat box in text form just as they're beginning to speak so that you can read them for yourselves in case you miss anything I say. And that'll be at the beginning of their respective presentations. So now let's begin by introducing our first two panelists. Iqbal Choudhary is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University, Halifax, Canada. He earned his Bachelor of Science, Master of Social Science degrees in Sociology from Shahaljal University of Science and Technology in Bangladesh, and another master's degree in sociology from the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada. In 2009, he joined Shah Jalal University as a lecturer of sociology and became associate professor in 2018. From fall 2020 to summer 2021, and we can all imagine what time that was, Iqbal worked as a part-time instructor in the Department of Sociology at St. Mary's University, as well as the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University, Halifax, Canada. His research interest is in issues related to migration and immigration, ethnic and racial diversity and multiculturalism, social determinants of mental health, positive mental health, social inequality, and social development. Iqbal is originally from Bangladesh, and now I think I have him residing in Halifax, but he is currently joining us in the midst of his research, I believe, gathering in Bangladesh, where it's the middle of the night, I'm afraid. Royden Loewen is a senior scholar and former chair in Mennonite studies at the University of Winnipeg. He serves on a number of Mennonite history and organic agriculture boards and is the series editor of the Ethnicity and Culture History series at University of Manitoba Press. His books focus on social and environmental history, like his most recent book, Mennonite Farmers, A Global History of Place and Sustainability, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2021. Over the years, Dr. Loewen has become a research fellow at universities at Cambridge, Guelph in Ontario, Victoria, BC, and Chicago, as well as Conrad Grebel College. Roy and his wife, Marianne, live in Winnipeg and have 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren. Roy and his son Sasha operate Millview Grain, a certified organic farm near Steinbach. And I would like it if we could begin with a brief introduction of the overall research project by Royden Loewen, which he claims he can do in 1 minute. I'm not sure if I'll hold him accountable to that 1 minute. After that, I'll ask Iqbal to go right into the first presentation entitled Contested Knowledge, Bangladesh Farmers Meet North American Agronomists. So Royden, over to you.
Okay. Transnational Flows of Agricultural Knowledge is the title of our session. It is also the title of a research project grounded at the University of Winnipeg Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. It's funded by the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada. It looks at agriculture based on knowledge and intersected by power. and has three components. The first one is importation of knowledge via settlers from Europe to Canada in the early part of the 20th century. The second part is the exportation of that knowledge via NGOs such as MCC, beginning in the mid-century. And then the third component is, again, the importation of agricultural knowledge via multinational corporations such as Monsanto and the International Organic Movement. The session today focuses on the second component, and that is the transfer of knowledge from mostly Canadian agronomists to places in the global south. And I've asked Iqbal to give our jointly authored presentation. So handing over to Iqbal.
Thank you, Roy and James, and good afternoon, I think, from Winnipeg, and good morning from Bangladesh. It is 4:30 in the morning. So I am going to present our paper on contested knowledge, Bangladesh farmers meet North American agronomists, co-authored by Professor Royden, Loewen. This paper, as the two following, are based on the idea that agriculture, that intervention into nature coaxing it to produce protein for human health, is based on knowledge intersected by power. Indeed, the scope of the Transnational Flow of Agricultural Knowledge project, based on flows of knowledge across borders, asks how knowledge affects social relationships. In our paper, we ask how such flow of knowledge was shaped. MCC's winter crop program began in 1972 in one of the most densely populated and agrarian nations on earth, Bangladesh. There was knowledge that MCC experts came to impart agricultural knowledge to Bangladeshi peasants, knowledge among partner organizations, including government researcher and pre-existing ancient rice knowledge. In our paper, we compared the ways North American MCC personnel saw the flow of information in annual reports, the ways annual reports they filed in the 1970s and 80s, and the ways in which Bangladeshi farmers interviewed just last week saw such flows. We argue that the narrative differs depending on the perspective taken. In the 1972, just 1 year after independence and after the devastating tidal wave that killed 300,000 people in the northern Noakhali district, MCC began an audacious program of fundamentally reforming agriculture in the area with its so-called winter crop program. Dryland crops, soybeans, sorghum, and a variety of vegetables would be cycled into ancient wetland rice production. Art Diffier of Winnipeg, who provided the initial leadership of this program, recalled in an interview for the TFOC project that MCC's approach was based on a self-confidence that MCC had the foundation of the knowledge required to meet Bangladesh's nutritional deficit. He quotes William T. Snyder, head of MCC, as saying, quote, "We know the country's 95% agriculture at the time. We know that it's got a famine. It's after war with a lot of destruction. And we also know that MCC has some significant abilities in agriculture." Unquote. But the crux of MCC's approach relied on inherited knowledge Mennonites had as farmers. Indeed, MCC would rely on its volunteer inherited knowledge. However, main challenge was to convince farmers to accept this new knowledge. A reading of annual agricultural report for the first 15 years of the winter crop program indicates the challenge MCC faced in introducing seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, and scientific methods from wider world. As Jerry Buckland and Peter Graham argue in a detailed 1990 analysis, MCC worked as an intermediary of knowledge transfer among researchers, government institutions, and subsistence farmers. But ultimately, it depended on skilled extension workers, mostly from Canada. Buckland and Graham are mostly laudatory of MCC's knowledge importation. But any knowledge flows from farmers to MCC is not really part of this story. Indeed, they gently chide MCC for its limited success in communicating farmers' needs to government researchers. This is also the crux of the story that arises from a study of MCC's annual reports on the winter crop program. It is a story of MCC imparting knowledge to farmers. The 1972 reports by MCC worker David Stockley, for example, chide the farmers for dismissing, quote, any possibility of crops in the dry season, unquote. According to the report, what farmers needed was financial, credit, fertilizer, seed, fresh water, and especially agricultural education. At the farmer who works in the field knows nothing about agriculture except his limited experience with osh and almond rice crops, unquote. The agenda was clear. MCC must help farmers understand modern agriculture. This approach of knowledge transfer to farmers shaped MCC's program for the first decade of the winter crop program. A report from 1975 restated MCC's middle position in Bangladesh, focused on demonstrating, quote, to the farmer that new crops can be grown commercially on his own land, unquote. At the heart of this agricultural program were young, white, educated North American volunteers. The flow of information from North Americans to Bangladeshis was clear. The report for 1977 indicated a change, now indicating that after 5 years, MCC had, quote, learned a great deal about winter crops and their production potential in Bangladesh, unquote, and that it now depended especially on some 30 techs, Tana agricultural coordinators, the indigenous university-trained extension workers, as they, quote, provided the crucial link between the scientist laboratory and the farmer's field, unquote. Still, this link was a one-way conduit of knowledge. The techs were especially successful when they crisscrossed Noakhali on their bicycles, quote, visiting the farmer in his field and showing him how to cultivate crops, unquote. By the 1980s, MCC report began de-emphasizing this one-way flow of knowledge. For one, MCC began handing extension work over the Bangladesh Agricultural Development Corporation, and it seemed farmers no longer needed the rudimentary knowledge they once needed, as their enthusiasm for winter crops like soybean was no longer in question. In 1981, MCC's annual report spoke of an almost organic flow of information from, quote, contact farmers, unquote, to neighbors, and even amongst the reclusive kitchen garden. In 1982 came an implicit confession. MCC needed to do a better job at carrying, quote, back to the research program the opinions of the farmers, unquote, for the fact that, quote, Bangladesh agriculture is old, intricate, and time-tested over a period of 100 years, unquote. The fields may seem to be shaped by an outdated system, but, quote, in many cases, it is the best system given the situation in which it operates. New technologies needed to be adapted to existing practices. Moreover, farmers often knew better. They preferred to plant in temperate November rather than the recommended hot December. They liked the old seeds broadcasting system, which sometimes bested the recommended line seeding. Their indigenous idea of intercropping sorghum with potatoes held immense promises. This flow of information from farmers to MCC rather than the other way around is also the story from Bangladeshi themselves. In an oral history project, literally began with just a week ago because of COVID restriction, both farmers and MCC officials spoke of the nature of such flows of information from Bangladeshi perspective. The farmers spoke of the agricultural knowledge that predated MCC's entry into Bangladesh. Farmer Rabiul Alam recalled almost nostalgically about the skill required, quote, to cultivate the land by cow and by handheld spade. We used to collect some seeds and plant them next year, depending only on rainwater, unquote. Farmer Tayyabur Rahman emphasized the skills required in indigenous wells and watering the agricultural land based on knowledge within the extended family. It was a matter of, quote, how to cultivate crop and when to cultivate, how to fix the plow, how to harvest and process crops, unquote. The ancient rice production system was no simple matter. The new fertilizer depended IR8 miracle rice may have tripled rice production, but farmers emphasized how old ways still held. Rabiul Alam recalled how, quote, we were introduced to chemical fertilizers and pesticides by the government agriculture officer. However, we continued using our traditional ways of using cow dung in the paddy field, unquote. Eventually, farmers did adopt chemical fertilizer and pesticides, but Rabiul Alam says he learned it mostly from fellow farmers. For there was no easy, quote, access to a government agriculture officer, unquote, while Tayyabur Rahman calls that he learned about modern ways simply from the market. Even farmers who encountered MCC emphasized indigenous wellsprings of knowledge, both the traditional culture and the source of Green Revolution technologies. It is a similar perspective to those who acknowledge MCC's crucial role in imparting knowledge to Bangladeshi farmers. Arifur Rahman, current head of MCC Bangladesh, for example, repeats the story of how in the 1970s, expatriate agronomists conducted research in Bangladesh, trained farmers in modern agriculture technologies and crop production systems, and also imported new varieties of seeds. But he also emphasizes how MCC's research depended on information from farmers, noting that, quote, MCC always sought to collect information from knowledge provided on problems directly from farmers' field, unquote. And his story focuses on the transition from knowledge provided by experts to knowledge brought home by Bangladeshis trained overseas. In the post-liberation war period when, quote, our country was not too strongly economically, unquote, says Rahman, quote, Bangladesh used to help scientists develop their capabilities, unquote, including offering scholarship for young Bangladeshi scientists to study in Canada, the USA, or other countries. And he hastened to add that only some North American volunteers came to Bangladesh, quote, with agriculture background, unquote, and those who did came to Bangladesh, quote, to engage in our activities, unquote, not to run them. Eventually, Bangladesh developed its own research program, and MCC focused more specifically on poor farmers and especially female farmers in the home site programs. When farmers speak especially about MCC in Bangladesh, they echoed the idea of Bangladeshi ingenuity. Female farmers, Ms. Kulsum Akhtar, for example, may recall how, quote, MCC provided training to 25 girls, including me, from my village. in the production of organic fertilizer such as trichocompost and vermicompost, along with goat rearing and cattle fattening projects, and quote, provided us goat and cows and cement rings for vermicompost, unquote, including the required earthworms. But she insists that the knowledge transfer was not a one-way conduit of knowledge imparting. Indeed, she says, while, quote, I have learned a lot from MCC, I was able to expand the knowledge that MCC showed me, adapting their technology in a way which they did not teach me, unquote. Producing vermicompost without the requisite cement rings, unquote. And when, quote, I showed them, they appreciated it and wanted to learn from me, unquote. Tayyabur Rahman, a male farmer, is even more assertive. Quote, MCC workers used to came to me and I used to train them, quote, showing them how vermicompost could be used on the evergreen betel perennials. Rabiul Alam explains this learning with greater details. He notes that MCC doesn't, quote, know everything about home-site farming, unquote. And while they, quote, provided us training on what they know, unquote, he himself has, quote, learned some new ways of producing vegetables and using fertilizers that they don't know about. And when we find new and different ways of production, we show them and they learn from it, unquote. He emphasizes how he has expanded on MCC's based knowledge. In conclusion, it is apparent that in Bangladesh, flows of agricultural knowledge evolved over time, but also that the narrative of such knowledge flows differ depending on whose perspective shaped the story. In a recent study on information flows among cotton farmers in India, cultivating knowledge, Andrew Flex writes that, quote, how farmers learn about their seeds determines the fate of their crop and their livelihood, unquote. An analysis of extent, MCC reports might emphasize the flow of knowledge to the farmers from experts without a great deal of insight on how traditional knowledge flowed from farmers or indeed from farmers to MCC. The first stages of an oral history project indicate the complexity of an ancient Bangladeshi agriculture and the process of interacting with new knowledge streams from an indigenous Bangladeshi perspective. Clearly, MCC's success in Bangladesh was based not only on giving the lecture, but on how local farmers adapted scientific knowledge to their own cultural understanding and natural restraints. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iqbal, and thanks, Royden, for that. Our next presenter is Marta. Marta Bunnett-Wiebe currently serves as Program Coordinator for MCC Manitoba's Peace and Advocacy Program. She is also a Senior Research Assistant in the Mennonite Studies Department at the University of Winnipeg. Marta is the editor of Germinating Conversations, Stories from a Sustained Rural-Urban Dialogue on Food, Faith, Farming, and the Land. And in addition to editing this book, Marta continues the Germinating Conversations initiative to foster dialogue between producers, eaters, and researchers through the organization of ongoing events. Marta's research for this project has focused on archival material covering MCC's agricultural programming and conflicting models related to agriculture development. Marta grew up on a farm in New Brunswick and currently lives and works in Winnipeg. When she is not working at MCC, Marta enjoys growing food for others as part of Prairie Light's shared farm in New Bergtal, Manitoba. Her presentation is Conflicting Models and Intersecting Impulses, a survey of influences on MCC Indonesia's agriculture program from 1970 to 1985. Marta, you have the floor.
Thanks, James. All right. The focus of my paper today is on MCC's agricultural program in Indonesia in the 1970s and 1980s, and the multiple agricultural models that held influence over this program. In examining MCC archival documents from 3 MCC program locations over these 2 decades, I find that MCC exhibited impulses towards participatory, context-driven models of development, while also showing influences from other conflicting models of agriculture. For some context, a considerable portion of MCC's work in Indonesia in the 1970s and 80s was carried out within the context of the Indonesian Transmigration Program, created by the Indonesian government to relocate Indonesians from densely populated islands to other less populated islands in the archipelago. This program was seen as a way to develop land and help the poor and landless, as well as strengthen national security. MCC was involved in facilitating development initiatives, including agricultural programs, in several transmigration locations. Today, I will be focusing on 3, Wayabang, Tulang Bawang, and Reso Jaya. James Sundberg, John Thompson, and Philip Woodhouse noted disjuncture in agricultural development beginning in the 1970s. Previously, agricultural research and development had largely been state facilitated. They argue that the 1970s marked the beginning of 3 key developments and the involvement of many non-state actors in the field. They define the key developments as the neoliberal project, the environmental movement, and the participation agenda. Alongside the neoliberal project to let the market rule, the larger project of modernization of this time made way for the Green Revolution, which was a plan to address hunger and the threat of communist revolution by introducing a package of inputs or a set of technologies to increase food production. At the same time period, the environmental destructiveness of modern agriculture, and in particular of agricultural chemical inputs, were increasingly becoming apparent. Moreover, there was growing recognition that these top-down models of agriculture were not able to take into account the specificities of the local environments of many of the farmers in the global south who were attempting to produce food on marginal land. Similarly, these models left no space for the unique concerns and needs of farmers. The environmental and participatory agendas emerged from these concerns. So now I'll present 2 case studies highlighting the ways in which the influences of these models of agriculture are present and intersecting in MCC's agricultural programs in Indonesia. In the 1970s, MCC's agricultural program was focused through its first transmigration program in Wayabang in Lampang province, Indonesia. A prevalent and ongoing concern of this agricultural program was the lack of soil fertility. Located on largely sandy soil with little to no soil organic matter, the land was rapidly degrading with every subsequent crop. In response, MCC tested and promoted numerous soil building measures in the region. The promotion of compost to increase soil organic matter was a significant focus of the program and was met with considerable success. In a report, MCC worker James Bowman wrote, quote, "I think every one of our farmers is making compost of some form," end quote. Green manures, a crop grown for reincorporation into the soil, and crop rotations were also promoted for their soil building qualities. The promotion of these practices of organic fertilizer, green manures, and crop rotation show a clear impulse within MCC towards the emerging environmental movement. As Bowman wrote, "I believe there is hope in rehabilitating the soil, though it will always be fragile and never fertile. The key to the problem is natural agriculture, the building of organic matter in the soil. I am sure that if there is any hope at all, it lies in natural agriculture," end quote. Having just highlighted the natural or organic impulse found in MCC's work in Wayabang, I will turn again to the reports of this same decade and location to elevate a contrasting impulse running concurrently through the program. News of the coming availability of commercial fertilizers was met with excitement by Bowman. Quote, "It is fantastically good news for farmers in Weyabong," end quote. Commercial fertilizers alongside insecticides and improved seeds were then readily included in the aspirations and program plans for Weyabong. When governmental and World Bank supply systems for chemical fertilizer fell through, MCC went so far as to organize distribution of commercial fertilizer for 1 year. Of that decision, Bowman wrote, quote, "We have noticed a fundamental change in the farmers' attitude about fertilizer. And I believe this came about as many farmers bought small quantities of fertilizer to try it and got hooked on it," end quote. This promotion of chemical fertilizer by MCC occurred alongside a broader extension program for an entire package of inputs for agriculture. The hallmarks of the package of inputs promoted during the Green Revolution: fertilizers, insecticides, improved varieties of seeds, extension, and market development, are all present in this program proposal in front of you, written by Bowman in 1977. The significance of this package of inputs is made quite clear. Delivery on these assumptions of need made by MCC were to form the foundation of MCC's agricultural program in Weyabong. The influence of the Green Revolution and its top-down delivery of agriculture development stands in stark contrast to the natural impulse outlined earlier, with its grassroots response to the needs of the local agroecosystem. However, there is little evidence that MCC worker James Bowman saw any substantial conflict between these two models of agriculture. Indeed, there are multiple instances in his reports where recommendations for use and promotion of commercial fertilizers and composting were both included on the same page, as can be seen here in this example. A close analysis would suggest he recognized that commercial and organic fertilizers had different functions on the soil, but that he did not see them as conflicting. He seemed to hold these two impulses, that of the Green Revolution and of the environmental movement, in tension. This is perhaps best exemplified in the following two statements, written not even 6 months apart by Bowman. First, I quote, "As it turned out, selling fertilizer was probably one of the best things we've done," end quote. And not 6 months later, quote, "In our teaching, we have given priority to pushing organic fertilizer. Organic fertilizer is both best and cheapest," end quote. In reading these reports, it is clear there were multiple influences on the MCC agriculture program in Indonesia in this decade. And while they appear to contrast one another, they were seemingly held in tension by MCC at the time. So now turning to two of MCC's agricultural programs in the 1980s, one in Tulang Bawang, South Sumatra, and another in Raiso Jaya in West Kalimantan. Two key foci of MCC's agriculture program in the 1980s were attempts to work at participatory and context-specific models of agriculture. The creation and support of farmers' groups was core to MCC's agriculture work in this decade. Providing development through groups of farmers, as opposed to individuals, was understood by MCC workers as a way for farmers to have more autonomy over their development, both during and after MCC was present in the area. MCC supported groups of farmers working collectively on making bulk purchases, running loan programs, and starting income generation projects by providing skills and leadership training for participants and organizers. Cropping systems management was another key focus of the 1980s. In response to critiques of the top-down or blueprint models of the previous decades, cropping systems research and management was an effort to shape research and practices around the needs of small farmers and the limitations of the local climate and soil conditions. MCC conducted its own research in the transmigration sites in order to develop a cropping systems pattern for the region, addressing the reality of the poor soils, finding crops that fit well within the environment, while keeping the research relevant to farmers. Proponents of these two participatory, context-driven methods, farmers groups and cropping systems, argued that these methods stand in contrast to the package of inputs developed in distant research institutes and transferred into new settings. MCC workers' own understanding of their approach to development fits within these lines. Reports from the program note that MCC was focused on using a bottom-up model of development. While there were likely genuine efforts by MCC to implement a more bottom-up model of development in the 1980s, I will complexify that narrative by highlighting a third impulse found in the MCC reports and documents of this decade in Indonesia. This third impulse is related to the term transfer of technology. The transfer of technology model of development was largely a top-down method, following in the lines of the package of inputs model of the previous decade. Transfer of technology models funneled products and knowledge from agribusiness corporations and research institutes on the outside through agricultural extensionists to local farmers. As noted in an MCC report in 1983, quote, "The big buzzword in Indonesia today is transfer of technology," end quote. MCC agricultural reports of this decade were replete with the use of the term. Within MCC, the 1980s marked a shift from a focus on capital transfer, that is the package of inputs, as well as oxen and credit, to an emphasis on transfer of technical knowledge and skills. Significant emphasis was placed on providing national staff and farmers with short courses in bookkeeping, economics, agriculture, project management, and household financial management. It would appear that while espousing a bottom-up model of agriculture, the influence of the technology transfer model was also enmeshed in MCC's agriculture program. A careful look at the farmers groups and cropping systems projects reveal influences of technology transfer. Farmers groups were reported to be a vehicle through which to transfer knowledge and inputs. The focus on economic education for farmers harkens to the Green Revolution emphasis on market-driven agriculture. While there were several reports of MCC workers' intentions to learn of farmers' knowledge through surveys and conversation, the focus of the cropping systems project was on intensifying production. As just a few examples. Academic analyses of the participatory and context-driven methods of the 1980s critique these methods as being fairly narrow in scope, as maintaining a commodity production orientation, and as just another method through which to deliver technologies. So what are the motivations behind MCC's use of the technology transfer model in this decade? It is not completely clear. One factor was likely the influence of the government of Indonesia. As is noted in a report from 1983, quote, "Our sole reason for being allowed to live among transmigrants is to stimulate the transfer of technology, first to the transmigrants and second to the government agents," end quote. Perhaps the technology transfer model was not so much a choice, but a requirement. Moreover, one has to wonder how influential the modern mentality that North Americans had solved the agricultural program, how much this mentality had an influence on MCC's agricultural programs of this time period. The impulse towards new participatory models is present. However, prevailing mentalities seem to hold strong influence and create contestation. In conclusion, in examining the agricultural program of MCC in Indonesia in the 1970s and 1980s, it is evident that multiple conflicting agricultural models held influence over MCC's agricultural program. Aspects of this agricultural program exhibit characteristics of the three key developments in agriculture of the time: the neoliberal project, the environmental movement, and the participatory agenda. Far from having one united approach, MCC's agricultural program in Indonesia exhibited and intertwined multiple conflicting models in its attempts to provide bottom-up agricultural development. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, and let's move on to our final presenter, Christopher Sundby. Christopher is a Master of Arts student in theology at Regent College in Vancouver. His current thesis research surveys Anabaptist interpretation of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He completed his bachelor's degree in 2019 in conflict resolution and Mennonite studies at the University of Winnipeg. His research for Dr. Loewen's project, Transnational Flows of Agriculture Knowledge, focuses on oral history work with Mennonites who have done overseas work. And his presentation, entitled Canadian MCC Agronomists and an Evolution of Knowledge, is based on those interviews, interpreting them alongside the influential book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Chris grew up in Victoria and then spent 5 years in Winnipeg doing that undergraduate degree. And he currently lives on the West Coast in Vancouver. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks, James. Yeah, happy to be here. Wish I could be with everybody in person in Winnipeg. I love it out there. I'm zooming in here from, Vancouver, which is unceded Coast Salish lands. In 1989, animal traction expert Paul Starkey published a book titled Perfected Yet Rejected: Animal-Drawn Wheeled Tool Carriers, a Cautionary Tale of Development. The book surveyed 50 different tool carrier designs across Africa, Europe, India, and Latin America, with Chapter 3 highlighting 4 different designs in Africa between 1955 to 75. One of these designs was the Mochudi tool carrier, designed in Mochudi, Botswana. According to Starkey, the tool carrier design began in 1973, was perfected in 1975, and in 1978, quote, 125 tool carriers were manufactured, of which 75 were bought for testing by various government agencies, a success by most standards. Behind the design and implementation of the Mochudi tool carrier was the young Manitoban Eric Rempel, an agronomist of Mennonite Central Committee on the Teachers Abroad program. He arrived, he tells me, in 1968 with no clear vision at all of what it was that we would be able to bring to those farmers, except that we were wealthy, they were poor, and what we had learned was what was possible with chemical agriculture. Rempel demonstrated these chemicals one day, spraying 2,4-D ounce of sorghum in Mochudi. The smell reminded him of his home near Steinbach, Manitoba. 2,4-D did not catch on, it was too expensive, but Rempel did design the tool carrier, and as he describes it, despite the obvious enthusiasm of the Mochudi Farmers Brigade, displays at agricultural shows, and promotion through on-farm demonstration, in which over 70 units were placed in farmer service and maintained by the Ministry of Agriculture, the Mochudi tool carrier had not been adopted by farmers on any large scale. He concludes, in the end, we managed to impress everybody except farmers with that. Rempel regretted his 2,4-D decision, and later, after reading Paulo Freire, came to see development as a dialogical process instead of a top-down one. Rempel reflects on his work in Botswana after reading Freire. As much as I thought I understood the conditions that these Botswana farmers were farming, really I didn't. They were the only ones who really understood that, and this whole idea was just not tested adequately with them. We moved too fast and didn't learn enough. This essay interprets Canadian agricultural development stories like these from a Freirean perspective, with an emphasis on knowledge exchange. I argue first the importance of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's work, especially Pedagogy of the Oppressed for MCC, beginning in the 1970s. And second, I argue that rejection or acceptance of Freirean ideas via MCC is behind much of my interviewees' descriptions and framing of their overseas experience, and thus the perceived flow of knowledge. During the 1970s, when Rempel was spraying 2,4-D and designing tool carriers in Mochudi, Paulo Freire's work was impacting MCC. In 1970, Peter J. Dick wrote in the Mennonite Quarterly Review at the 50th anniversary of MCC that Mennonites quote, simply are not doing a very commendable job as Mennonites in training our young people for dialogue and encounter with non-Mennonites and non-Christians. He was unaware that the next decades would begin to center themes of dialogue and encounter within MCC, aided over those decades by Freire and Mennonites who took up his ideas. Dick recognized that, quote, in many instances, the root of the problem is fear. And, quote, the basic problem generally is not lack of knowledge, it is fear of putting that knowledge to work. These ideas prefigure some of Paulo Freire's insights for a pedagogy of the oppressed, the title of his first major book published in English in 1970. The book proposed a new understanding of education, one that focuses on dialogical methods for literacy leading to conscientization. That is, critical reflection with others on one's reality of oppression through problem posing, which leads to liberative praxis, all of which is opposed to a banking model of education where the teacher has knowledge and the student is an object to be filled with that knowledge. As D. Merrill Ewart described it, relating Freire to agricultural development in his 1977 doctoral dissertation on Freire and development in Zaire, considerable research and planning have gone into developing programs to diffuse modern ideas and technology to rural peasants in the name of education. Extension, as this process is commonly referred to, is seen as a vehicle for transmitting knowledge or as an accelerator in expanding agricultural production. This conceptualization of the educational process as the transfer of knowledge and technology from the developed to the traditional sectors assumes that someone knows what is good for the peasants, and that the problem of development is to convince them to adopt whatever is being touted as the solution. Not surprisingly, the literature is filled with well-documented failures of programs. He contrasts that with a Freirean concept based on, quote, problem posing instead of problem solving, dialogue instead of monologue, transforming unjust structures rather than helping people adapt to them. Fremont Rieger published his doctoral work on Freire in the same year and evokes the same Freirean analysis. Quote, the developed have interpreted for the underdeveloped what their condition was and what ought to be done about it. The result has been, in some cases, a rather abstract top-downing. In other cases, it has been almost a conscious domination. With Ewart and Rieger writing in 1977, we're reacting against the 1960s and early 70s that was not living up to its promises of development, and invoking Freire as a helpful theorist in reaction. It is with these themes and this era of protest of the late 60s and 70s that Robert S. Crater asked in a 1970 MCC 50th anniversary essay, quote, dare the peaceable Mennonites become the outspoken Mennonites? I believe that throughout the 1970s, inspired by Paulo Freire's writings, many Mennonites within MCC did become outspoken advocates for a more liberative form of development, largely through the Development Monograph series. In 1975, MCC began publishing a development monograph series, the first titled Thoughts on Development by Edgar Staves, arguing for the centering of people and social justice in development. He writes, referencing Freire, quote, development is the process by which people are awakened to opportunities within their reach. Development is people with an increasing control over their environment and destiny, people with dignity and a sense of self-worth. Development is freedom and wholeness and justice. It is people living in the full realization of their God-given potential. It is a liberated spirit. It is people with rising expectations. Development is the new word for peace. In the 1977 revised version, Staves describes development as not only peace, but, quote, people with a liberated spirit, freedom, wholeness, and justice. Staves' definition of development in his revised monograph removed self-reliance and economic growth from the definition and focused on, quote, people's struggle in which the poor and oppressed are the active participants and beneficiaries. The Freirean concepts and influences are clear. They continue through Merrill Ewart's monograph on humanization, Luann Martin's monograph on women and development, Doris Jansen Longacre's nutrition and development, Nancy Hasey's integrating education and development, which emphasized social justice and people's struggle. Hasey also noted the revolutionary nature of Freire's pedagogy. Education, quote, education must not be remedial, a tool to improve upon current societal situations, but rather revolutionary, designed to overthrow unjust societal structures. Juanita Leonard's monograph in 1978, Family Life Education, again used Ewart's Freirean definition and noted that the National Christian Council of Kenya in 1975-76 was using Ferry's work in its education programs. Gordon Hunsberger's Land and Development in 1982 asked, "Are we sowing the seeds of violent revolution if we help in identifying these factors?" He concludes, "That may depend on how it is done." As Ellen F. Weaver writes in his recent book, Service in the Ministry of Reconciliation, quote, "The 1970s saw the start of a multi-decade creative ferment and rethinking within MCC about the nature of service." He notes that these monographs argued a, quote, "bottom-up mode of development while critiquing the optimism that drove modernization theory." Ferry's method by the mid-1980s was receiving wide recognition. One 1984 article in the International Review of Education called his theory a, quote, "bright spark in an otherwise bleak contemporary world." Service, now, according to F. Weaver, came to be viewed as an exercise in connecting peoples, building connections across lines of national, cultural, religious, racial, and class differences. Ferry appears to have been an influential part of this shift. For the 1980s, Ferry's influence spanned across South America, Africa, North America, and into Bangladesh, causing a shift in development thinking. Ferry's influence impacted how North Americans viewed their global work. For Rempel, who I began this paper with, his reading of Freire a decade after his work in Botswana completely shifted his perspective. He arrived at maturity in 1968 from community, where the 1950s and 60s, quote, "any progressive farmer would be using chemical farming." And so he brought those with him. Just as Elfab from Saskatchewan in the mid-1970s brought a backpack sprayer to La Paz, Bolivia. In the shift to chemicals, David Neufeld of southern Manitoba remembers his father burning down his barn around 1970, since he no longer needed manure after adopting commercial fertilizer. Neufeld remembers his father's attitude towards the shift. "Oh no, we got a better way now." Neufeld, after returning from his time with MCC in South Africa, he was there in 1982 to 91, rejected this better way. While in South Africa, he learned new ways to farm and realized, quote, "growing food, it's a political act." On Neufeld's return, he began an organic farm, a way for him to resist gently, that's a quote from him, the changes occurring in agriculture in North America. He remembers in South Africa the introduction of a hybrid corn seed in 1983 that yielded corn 3 times the size of the traditional corn grown, but with the inability of local farmers to save the seed and thus losing some autonomy. Tim Lin of MCC stressed to Neufeld the need to listen and learn. This listening and learning was meant to influence not only Africa, but according to Neufeld, Lin expressed that, quote, "we were not sent there by God to teach, we were sent there by God to listen, and perhaps influence North America by what we learned." The Ferrian themes of liberating not only the oppressed, but the oppressor, and the need for North Americans to change their ways is clear in Neufeld's description and experience. For Neufeld, farming is not neutral, but in South Africa, involves solidarity to the oppressed and resistance to the apartheid regime. At the time that Neufeld was shifting to organics in the 1990s, conservation agriculture was gaining traction in development work. Winnipegger Alden Brawl, who worked in Bolivia from 1993 to 2002, became a strong advocate. In our interview, he emphasized the importance of his mentor, Roland Bunch, and his influential 1982 book, 2 Years of Corn, which draws on Ferry's work for smallholder farmers. In his more recent book, advocating for green manure cover crops, Bunch argues that, quote, "many people working in agricultural development strongly believe that farmers should participate in their own agricultural development. I would go one step further than that. I believe that farmers should become the protagonists, the architects, or as Paulo Freire wrote, the authors of their own development." In our interview, Brawl emphasized relationships, dialogues, innovation, and the need to organize field days in which local farmers could share information as the answers, this is a quote, "the answers really lie within the people there." All Freirean ideas. Brawl notes that in his work promoting green manure cover crops was not, quote, "super successful. There were some growers that were using it, but they were pretty reliant on the use of agrochemicals, fertilizers, and different inputs. Unfortunately, they don't have an organic market, which growers in Canada do. So they could never really capitalize on it." Like Neufeld, he returned home with an interest in sustainable food practices. Brawl's comment on the lack of a market in Bolivia for organics emphasizes a point made to me by Manitoban Harold Duick. For the critics of the Freirean shift, such as Duick and Art de Fer, the Freirean model leading to liberation is seemingly naively lacking a form of developmental realism. For Dueck, markets are the solution. A self-described cynic, he stresses to me that his work in the occupied territories in Palestine in the 1980s was political in all senses, dealing largely with officials and handshakes. For him, his farming upbringing taught him markets. But even with this stress on markets, there was still some Freirean ideas. He noted how Palestinians under occupation are alienated from the land and live in fear, which limits their capacity for action. His role was one of solidarity and, quote, supporting people to stay on the land, and that, quote, working with them involved the politics of saying, go and do it, because the Israelis forever tried to control them and get them not to do it. For Freire, this is one of the key shifts of conscientization. But unlike Freire, who was critical of globalized markets, Dueck stressed the need of access to these markets for development, as the growers in Palestine did not need any technological help, but access to markets. He worked to bring Palestinian-grown fruit and vegetables to European markets, noting in a comment on Mennonites, quote, there's something remarkably nonviolent about wanting to move a tomato across a hostile border. For Dr. Fair, who was in Bangladesh with MCC in 1972 to 74, research became a major deciding factor, drawing on his education and business skills. DeFair in our interview noted the shift from desiring quantity development to nutrition, and thus introduced soybean. DeFair also notes the problem with the UNICEF #6 pumps that have been introduced, brainstorming a solution through traveling repair people and implementing the treadle pump. He told me, quote, when I look at underdevelopment, I said, if we really studied it, I wonder how much of this so-called poverty and the people have no choice, or the fact that people can't organize themselves, and things that are not that difficult, but it requires certain rationality, sometimes communal cooperation, sometimes some wisdom at the top. With a Bengali counterpart, in a Freirean sense, DeFair noted, quote, we will do no experimental farms. We will do all of our testing with farmers, and the idea being that it's not only an agricultural scientific issue we have to solve. DeFair, in an essay titled And Some Fell on Rocky Soil from 1974, notes that, quote, the Western world relates to the developing nations in terms of knowledge and technology. Presumably, our approach must go beyond this. And that, quote, fundamental problems can only be resolved with the very active participation of the people themselves. Both DeFair and Dueck criticized other NGOs for their naive work in their regions, and also viewed commerce and globalization as helpful and important for development. For Freire, capitalism and globalization are both hindrances to true development. To end where I began, a report from 1974 for the Botswana Christian Council described Rempel's tool carrier as, quote, little short of revolutionary. And when the Mennonite volunteer who has developed the machinery returns home next year after 6 years in Botswana, it will be with a tangible achievement to his credit. The tool carrier was abandoned only a few years later. For Freire, it is the people at the bottom who know their own liberation. And as Lynn Longnecker puts it, referencing Freire, education should be participatory, centered on dialogue around questions that are relevant to participants' lives, through which they discover a new understanding of their reality. Freire's ideas have been important for attempts to shift away from top-down colonial forms of development. Freire sparked a revolution in understanding for development and education, and helped shift the way that agriculturists engage in their overseas work, as I've tried to show. Even with those who would be critical of Freire and some of his ideas as naive, there are still echoes of his ideas in their criticism. In sum, Freire's ideas have had a large influence on those working with MCC since the 1970s, and the knowledge they have returned home with. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christopher, for that. That was a nice high-level view of philosophy of doing development and education. While we have you here, Chris, we do have time for questions. I apologize. I'm looking at my clocks here, and I realize you're right, Royden. I think I must have started 2 minutes late because Microsoft is telling me it's 4:28, and Apple is telling me it's 4:30. I don't know what to make of that. You can draw your own conclusions. But we do have time for questions. And so I want to start with a quick one here while we have you here, Christopher. There's a question from Brian Fraze. Did Freire impact most or all or only some of your interviewees? Maybe you can quickly answer that one.
I would say some. Yeah, there's a lot of interviewees that I could actually. There's some in the comments here, and that I haven't referenced in this paper. They'll be in the longer one because I had to cut things down. But yeah, I don't think explicitly only a couple. and through other methods more. But yeah, I hope that answers that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, go ahead, Christopher.
No, I was just gonna say he's in a lot of the literature, I think, but I don't know other than that.
Okay, thanks. There were two questions that came in that were touching on very similar ideas, so I was going to maybe present them both at the same time, particularly for Marta. Anna Vogt is asking, curious about your thoughts on the benefits and drawbacks of the mixed models of agriculture that MCC used in Indonesia during that time period. Similar also to the one from Jim Cornelius, who says, your presentation would seem to suggest that drawing on different or contesting models in a program is inherently problematic. May it not suggest something different, that no one model fully explains or deals with the real problems that farmers face? Wrestling with and drawing on different models may in fact be a strength, even if messy. I'm going to pass that one to Marta to talk about, and then I might pass it to another panelist or two. Go ahead, Marta.
Sure, thanks for those questions. So as a direct response to Jim's question, I think there are probably possibilities for it to be a strength, and that if it's acknowledged as a mixed system or using multiple systems, and there's an awareness of that, then I think that could be a good thing if you're drawing on maybe the best parts of both of those models. I think there's perhaps a danger in thinking or assuming on the part of MCC or the development agency that you are running one system, and particularly I'm thinking of a participatory model, and yet if you're also if you think you're running a participatory model and yet maybe farmers don't have as much input as you'd like to think they had, perhaps. I think there's a danger there. And perhaps if there is a recognition that you are using multiple systems and one works at minimizing the difficulties or those points of confliction between models, and then there's an active response to that could also be a strength by drawing on the best of models and working at the places where they cause conflict or rub between them. I'll hand it over to others on the panel if they want to respond.
Iqbal, did you have something to respond to around that?
So in this question, there is a question about my perspective in case of the global, that as a resident of Global South, significant too. As I have not yet, I just started, I started interviewing farmers. I have not yet gone to the field, because of the COVID restrictions, but from readings and from my residential knowledge that I am a Bangladeshi, so I can just share my ideas that Bangladeshi farmers traditionally has agricultural knowledge, of doing agriculture by using cow and using the as pesticide, as fertilizers by cow dungs. So they had existing traditional agricultural knowledge. And they also had some introduction of the more modern agricultural knowledge, that is chemical fertilizers and some tractor, power tillers, those type of instruments, but they don't have access to government officers at that time. They don't have access to trainings. It's direct training from the government officers. But when MCC came to Bangladesh, actually MCC started providing them not only trained them, they provided ingredients for the agriculture. In agriculture, for example, seeds and other, help them to build some irrigation instrument technologies. This is, and in case of the religion, I can see that So actually, this was not receiving the knowledge was not a problem, but only the problem was it is general with NGOs. When NGO come to Bangladesh and the part from the Muslim groups, they become a little bit suspected. And as MCC is a Christian religion based organizations, some Muslims were a little bit fearful at the beginning when MCC started working, that it might affect their religious view, it might convert them from Muslims to other religion. But eventually, when they saw that no, it is not the purpose of MCCs, actually they started appreciating and accepting the MCC knowledge provided by MCCs. I think that when I go to field, I might have broad knowledge about this.
Thanks, Iqbal. I'm not sure, Royden or Chris, if you had anything to add to that. We have a couple more questions coming in, but we have time. Go ahead, Roy.
Well, no, but it's been wonderful working with Iqbal, partly because of the perspective that he brings to this. The irony of this conference, I think it was mentioned earlier this morning, is that we actually have very few representatives who are born and raised in the global South who are presenting, and yet MCC is this organization that has become world-renowned for its its outreach overseas, and especially with a sensitivity to local culture. So, but I think those interviews that Iqbal did earlier this week or last week from his hotel room via Skype, but within Bangladesh, really added another layer to this story. So I think I'm competing with another voice here. I'll hand over back to you, James.
Evan, if you could mute Laura, please.
Because I actually thought of that last night. I thought, I wonder if today is the deadline.
Evan, thank you, Evan. Sorry about that. Were you done, Royden?
Yes, I'm done. I'm eager to hear. I'm eager to hear from the other panelists. Well,
why don't we go to a question from Alan here? Alan Harder says, I was the MCC program director in 1982 to 88. The transfer of technology concept was just emerging then. We focused on appropriate technology. The interest was making available current good practices in community development, developed and adapted by Indonesians. In Rasa Jaya, MCCers developed technologies to help trans migrants cope with peat soils, for example, water filtration for household consumption and brick making, introducing soybeans in Tulang Bawang aimed to make agriculture sustainable. Transfer of technology is a multi-leveled concept. The government considered MCC work as a pilot project for working with settlers. Could, quote, lateral transfer of technology, unquote, work for you? And that's his question. And I'm not sure who to that question. I know Marta is talking about Indonesia, so I'd pass it to her first. But it sounds like a question of semantics here a little bit. What do you have to say to that, Marta?
Sure, I agree that that transfer of technology could mean a lot of things, and like what those technologies are and where they're coming from. The examples here that Alan have given are ones that were researched and developed in Indonesia in these transmigration sites at the time. And that does fit with, as was noted, a more community development orientation. Indonesia is also, and these transmigration sites are also an interesting place of development because these were often landless people who were moved to new islands and who very well may not have had agricultural knowledge that they're bringing with them. Transfer of technology, as Iqbal noted, and its interactions with local knowledges is a place, I think, of potential contestation. But I think transfer of technology can also refer to these products or knowledges from outside of the country, from North America particularly. And so the details there of how many of the transfers of technology in Indonesia were based on local research, and what was coming in from outside. I mean, we can just continue to plumb the depths of the archives there. But I think it does represent at least an orientation to development that reflects on bringing technologies in, knowledges in, and how that interacts with local and Indigenous knowledges as a place for further conversation.
Thanks, Marta. And Alan sounds like he has a wealth of experience being in the position that he was. Alan, feel free to add anything you'd like in response in the chat to everyone. That would be fine. In the meantime, moving on to a question from Art Fair. I note the criteria in presentation seems to be the theoretical development model. What if the criteria would be the outcome for the relevant population 10 or 20 or 30 years later? Would the conclusion be different? I appreciate the discussion. It's a higher level question about the research. I don't know, Royden, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Art. It's an excellent question. I think that the question that we are asking in part is of narrative and not trying to, as historians, and I think it's instructive that none of us panelists have been MCC workers overseas, and it's somewhat intimidating to see in the audience quite a number of MCC workers, and so that we are purporting to be experts on something which we in fact are not experts. We are trying to understand by going through the records and a particular historical narrative. And that narrative is about perspective. And so the question that Iqbal and I were asking, for example, was not whether something worked or something didn't work, or what particular sort of theoretical model was more effective, but how does the narrative change when you, depending on what lenses you look at the particular project. And so for one, so in fact, we had the privilege of interviewing Mr. Defair, who was instrumental in the winter cropping program initiative in Bangladesh. We also looked at MCC reports and understand that they were written for a particular reason, and the reasoning behind those reports obviously had to do to meet certain programmatic targets, or indirectly appealed to constituents' continuing support. And when Iqbal interviewed the farmers, it's instructive to understand that the farmers would think of themselves as being in possession of an ancient rice culture, which was not simplistic from their perspectives, but rather a complex agrarian intervention. And that when MCC comes along and says, would you also consider this? They do accept that, but their perspective is different. And I think by adding these voices, we create a more fulsome narrative. So I think this is, so as a history project, it is to try to describe what occurred, not necessarily evaluate the efficacy of a particular program.
Thanks, Art, for that question, and thanks, Royden. There's a question here for Iqbal from Robert Enns. Iqbal, as a citizen of Bangladesh, you have a unique perspective in your initial stage of interviews. How do you feel about current practices in MCC in this regard in Bangladesh?
I think that, so in my last response, so I touched this partly, But from my impression, and as a university teacher, I taught rural sociology, and part of the rural sociology was the NGO's intervention in rural development. So and from the readings and from talking to the farmers, and so when I came to know about MCC's intervention in Bangladeshi rural development, I think that MCC, in my personal view, that MCC is intervening in the Bangladesh, what is called in the rural development of Bangladesh, and it is helping Bangladesh to have self-sufficiency, nutritional self-sufficiency. Because as I interviewed some farmers, and when I will go to field, probably I will get more. So some of the farmers are really, self-sufficient now, because they told me that earlier they would just, produce food, rice only for their own consumption. Now they can consume for their family and themselves, and they can sell some of their productions outside. That means MCC is helping not only for what is called the protein deficiency, self-sufficiency, but also they are trying to develop, help farmers to build their economic capabilities, and also women empowerment. So one of the farmers, I heard that she earlier when she started the project of vermicompost, and people of her area used to, and told her that, oh, you are being a Muslim, so you are getting money just selling the earthworm. So, but now when she got reported to different newspapers, she got awarded from government officials during programs. Now people are, respecting her. People are coming to her to know her perspective, know her way of doing things, because that means as a MCC is doing good jobs in the context of, protein self-sufficiency, economic capability building, and also women empowerment.
Thanks, Iqbal, and thanks for that question. I don't have any other questions right now coming in, but I did want to invite panelists also to feel free to ask your fellow panelists a question if you have one. I had a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I have a question. I mean, I think Christopher got off a little bit too easy there earlier. You introduced Ferrari to us, but I think the question came in is, to what extent did you see that in your interviewees? I think you need to take a little more time, Christopher, and talk about that, or the various. What was the theoretical influence, or what do you think the impulse? I mean, the subtitle of our conference is a humanitarian impulse. If you're analyzing the reason and the reasoning, and I think the first question sort of had part of that. I think Robert Ence's question had part of that in there. What's the framework by which most of your interviewees went overseas?
By which did they go originally, Roy?
Yeah. What motivates them? What's their cosmology? What's their worldview? If it's not Ferrari, I mean, you said earlier that you thought Ferrari maybe influenced a minority of your interview. I mean, you interviewed some 20 possibly retired agronomists or folks who had volunteered overseas. So what's the impulse that sent them?
I mean, a bit of a mixed bag, but generally it was because it was what you did. If you were a young MCC lad or a young Mennonite lad, on the farm, and you wanted some adventure, or several folks have said, well, that's what my friends were doing. A lot of them said, when I arrived, I didn't really know what I was doing. I showed up, and MCC kind of had a couple jobs for me, but by and large, that would have been, I guess, the 70s. What I was trying to do in the paper was, because there's a shift that occurs. That's quite sort of, I think, well known sort of in the MCC world, and how, I guess, in the development world in a way. How did that come about? What was the motivating? And so then I was looking at the theoretical and Freire's sort of influence. But yeah, Freire comes after, I think, for a lot of people, or as they go out, they encounter Freire in literature or in MCC sort of perspective. I mean, Roland Bunch, who's really influential in the conservation agriculture stuff, is influenced by Freire. But yeah, I think he comes later. I mean, for Eric Rempel, it wasn't until 10 years later that he read Freire, and it totally changed the perspective on how we viewed what he was doing in Botswana. Does that answer your question, Roy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and it would be great if we could turn this into a seminar in a sense, and actually have some of the folks who are tuning in who've had that experience overseas to say, in what respect did your own views change while you were overseas, and was there a reverse flow of knowledge that you then directed back to your own homeland, in this case, Canada or the US?
Right, I think there was. I mean, I think there's MCC literature out there too about MCCers coming back and not fitting in with the constituency that they left from because they had a shift in how they viewed the world, whether politically or socially. And many of my interviewees spoke of that. I mean, one of them went off, this couple went off to go to school, to university to go to a master's because they didn't want to return to their home community because they had changed too much to fit in. And I think, yeah, for David Neufeld, his organic, he comes sort of this organic guru in southern Manitoba, and he was, his time in South Africa was very influential on that, the type of stuff he was doing out there and the sort of politicization. For him, the farming is, yeah, it's political. It's a way to resist certain trends that he doesn't view as good.
A lot of what we've been talking about, and I'm seeing Alan posted something else in the chat, which is helpful to read, but a lot of what we've been talking about is approach. MCC is a certain approach, and whether we talk about transfer technology or whatever language we're using, I guess my curiosity is for panelists is now we are increasingly facing the challenge as NGOs about decolonizing development. Is that just a new term for the same thing, or what's new about the idea of decolonizing and how does your research speak into that? Does anybody want to tackle that question?
Well, just to say that it certainly seems to be a subcurrent here in the entire conference. I think Freire has come up multiple times, and the language of colonialism is certainly here. I think that it reflects. I mean, Ellen F. Weaver talks about the evolution too. The lovely little history of MCC at 100 about that MCC's outlook is changing in the 80s and 90s with this new sensibility. And certainly, I think that reflects the MCC annual reports that we went through with regard to Bangladesh. But I think what's interesting is that when Iqbal goes and interviews these farmers, they're not necessarily versant in these philosophical currents. But there is just simply a somewhat more nuanced perspective on what occurred, because in a sense, we're all at the center of the universe, right? We all, as individuals, we process information that comes our way through our own inherited perspectives. And so just to ask them these questions, from your perspective, what occurred, I think is very instructive, and so I mean, ultimately, at least personally, I'm driven by curiosity. What happened? What's the most fulsome story that we can obtain? I mean, we're human beings, and as workers or as recipients of knowledge or as conveyors of knowledge, we're in this matrix knowledge exchange, and I'm driven by trying to understand what happened.
The question is whether Alan posted this into the chat to everyone. No, he posted it to the hosts and panelists. And for some reason, the way the Zoom is set up, I can't grab that text and put it in to everyone. So if there's a way that you can do that, Alan, feel free to do that. And Art also did the same thing. He posted another comment in there. So if you folks want to post that, just click everyone in the chat and you can add it there. On that question, though, we want to give our panel, we have just a couple of minutes left, our panelists one last comment on that larger question, if you want. We heard from Roy, but I'd like to hear one more comment. We don't have any other questions. So one more comment from Iqbal and Chris and Marta, and then I think we'll wrap up. Did you have anything to add, any of you? We'll give you one last kick at the can here. Starting with you, Chris.
I mean, I think there's, Frary gets appropriated by Mennonites. And a lot of the literature I was reading, it basically comes to a point where they say, yeah, we like Frary and his ideas, and, dialogue is good and problem posing and this kind of stuff, but let's not take it too far. Let's not actually follow through with the Fraryian idea of revolution in a way, or liberation. And so there's a sense that, yeah, I mean, Frary is appropriated in this sort of colonized way, where, Frary's point essentially is that, the oppressor needs to be liberated as well, but that's not going to be, a fun, I don't know, and so these ideas, how Frary wants a large shift in everything, and there's MCC folks who would talk in that way, and there's other MCC folks who don't, and I don't know what's the most appropriate model for development. I've never that's not for me to answer. It's not my field, but I think in the research I was doing, there's certainly the sense that there's a taming of Frary, which is, yeah, I think tied up in that question.
How about you, Marta?
I'll hand it over to Iqbal and give myself one more minute to think.
Iqbal?
Okay, so in my consideration that I don't, I'm not sure whether we can apply the model of decolonization in the context of MCC's intervention in Bangladesh. But in one way, we can mention that the way the intervention has been changed over time, because first salter used to come from the Canada, and the experts from Canada used to come to Bangladesh and conduct research and try to help Bangladeshi farmers. But nowadays, so they don't do this type of activities. They depend on Bangladeshi own research outcomes. As MCC collaborated with Bangladeshi governments organizations, and their Bangladeshi government organization are conducting research based on the Bangladeshi ways of agriculture, and how to improve those Bangladeshi ways of agricultural technologies and systems. And MCC is collecting this information from them and transporting this knowledge to farmers. And also farmers, from 3 interviews I found that they are not taking the knowledge that has been transferred by MCCs directly as it is, but they are applying their own way of understanding knowledge, and they are trying to expand the MCC's provided knowledge in their own way to their agricultural production. So this is, but I said I don't know that whether we can apply directly that decolonizing perspective here.
Thanks, Iqbal. If we go with Microsoft, Marta, you've got 2 minutes, a minute and a half.
Okay, great. I think as my part of the research has been predominantly looking at archival documents, I think one of the gifts of this larger project is that we will hopefully hear more from farmers directly and from MCC national staff in these programs that we've been looking at only from predominantly North Americans writing reports. And so I think as we look towards this research And adding that part in, I think it gives us a really good layer and a real balance between what we're seeing in the archives and how others remembered and carry on that, and using both of those pieces to then make an analysis of what happened then, as well as what that can give us as recommendations for today.
Okay.
James, if I just may just quickly add that we have another researcher in Bolivia, Giovanna Carreño from Bolivia, who's doing research there. We have Jeremy Weeb and Jody Nurse in Canada, who are doing research amongst Canadian farmers. And so that I hope that after, and I should say, this is the very first time we've reported on TFOC at all. And this is a multi-year program, and hopefully our research deepens, matures, and we have a more fulsome picture as we proceed.
That's great. Thanks, Royden. And I guess we'll have to follow you and your researchers in some way to hear about that. You'll keep us attuned. So that's the end of our time right now. I want to really thank Iqbal, Royden, Marta, and Chris for your work, for your sharing your stories and your information. That's very much appreciated. That ends the session, but there is more to this conference. We're going to take a break for supper, I think, for 2 hours. And then it looks like there's a featured evening event from 7 to 9, MCC as incubator and catalyst. And your capable chair there is Ben Nobs-Thiessen. So look forward to that. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thanks so much, everybody.